I want to welcome you all. Thank you for joining us for today's program, All Things Must Pass, a discussion led by Cristina Ferrigno, presented as part of Art as Social Action, 10 Years of Social Practice Queens, an exhibition that's currently on view at the Queens Museum. The artists and panelists of today's program have put together some rules and engagement for this program that I will share. They would like you to know that this is a safe space for the difficult and sensitive topic of grief. Panelists and this audience agree to interact with open, intentional, and care-filled communication in this space, free of judgment, harassment, and abuse. Because of the sensitive nature and raw topic of conversation, all questions and comments will be addressed at the end of the discussion. So you can add your questions and comments in the chat box, and after the presentation, we will address them. I will also paste these agreements into our chat so you can look back at them. So without further ado, I want to introduce the speakers that Cristina has invited today, starting with Cristina herself. Cristina Ferrigno is a Colombian-born adoptee, artist, and curator raised in New York City. Her combined media work center identity, memory, and community. She will resume the pursuit of her MFA with Social Practice Queens this fall. Chloë Bass is an artist and writer who is based between New York City, where she was born and raised, and St. Louis, Missouri. She is the co-director of Social Practice Queens and teaches at Queens College, CUNY. Rebecca Shapass is a filmmaker and interdisciplinary artist who was born and raised in New York City. She currently resides in Pittsburgh, PA, where she is pursuing an MFA in visual art at Carnegie Mellon University. Janice Quiles Reyes is a New York, Kenya, Queens-based artist, educator, and mother, completing her master's in arts education at NYU. She's been doing grief work utilizing art with families surviving pregnancy and infant loss for the past 9 years. And Liene Bosquê is a Brazilian multidisciplinary artist and mother based in Miami. Bosqué's practice encompasses installation, sculptures, site-specific works, and socially engaged projects. She is currently an adjunct professor at Florida International University. So welcome to these incredible panelists and to Cristina, who's going to open up the space for this program. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I appreciate all of you. And a special thank you to my panelists, friends, and fellow artists. I would like to just reiterate that because this is a sensitive topic, that, the discussion, can get a little heavy. So this is just sort of a content note that, we will be talking about grief and the pandemic and how hard it can be. And feeling things is okay. Emotions are good, and that's kind of the point. So we're all just going to take a breath and breathe. And thinking about people, places, and things that we've lost and have missed over the past year and over our lifetimes. So this program is a public program based on this zine that I made called All Things Must Pass. I am going to drop the link for the project website in the chat so that anybody who hasn't yet seen the zine can take a look, download, and print their own, or follow along with us as we go through the discussion. The zine breaks up different aspects of grief by different topics. So loss of a loved one, loss of place, loss of structure, etc., etc. And we're going to talk about a lot of these different facets of grief and how they've affected us in a multitude of ways. Grief is a spectrum. You can feel it very intensely at a certain point in your life, and then it kind of tapers off, and then it might come back. And you might feel different aspects of grief at the same time. This particular zine was extremely personal to me because this past October, I lost my father. It has been a really, really difficult year. And this is the first project, artwork that I've really made for public consumption since then. So thank you all for being a part of this. I really appreciate it. And because of this sensitive nature, I really wanted to choose these panelists based on their extreme emotional capacity and generosity, especially when talking about really difficult topics. I trust all of them, and it's been amazing just having these conversations with you all. My work has also, for a long time, been about nostalgia, family, and grief. So, and I also work a lot with trying to bring sort of my emotions and my experiences outward to the public. So that's how this project came about. Now, as the author, I have a hard time understanding how other people are reacting to it. So that's why I've assembled this lovely group to tell me a little bit how they experienced going through this zine. So my question to you all is, what stood out to you? What things what things resonated? What things did you really connect with? And anybody can jump in.
I'll start. I'll take the dive. Hi, and thank you so much again, Christina, for being so intentional about the space that you've created within your work, and also for this evening. And I am absolutely honored to be within this great group of artists, people who are willing to have this conversation. I am, whenever I am needing a moment to, when I spiral out in the middle of reliving a trauma, feeling grief for another close family member, I'm a sponge. I take it in. And when I'm managing my own, I need something tangible, because there's so much intangible. There's so much in the air that throws me into confusion of what I should be feeling or thinking. So what I really loved, which made sense to me, was the loss of touch page on page 9, where you have you've essentially created a sensory box. And what I love about that is that I've always built like little ofrendas, or little I use cigar boxes to kind of decorate the inside and outside for like a little travel case of things that I love. I'll add like crystals, I'll add feathers, or things I find along the way during the day that one lovely person in my life, in my very first moments of like deep grief and trauma years ago, told me to surround myself with beauty. those things that are soft and gentle and that I want to be surrounded with. So
Janice, I'm just going to share my screen quickly
Sure.
to show some of these ofrendas that you've made. So
Yeah.
talking.
Yeah, sure. I just have the one that was mostly inspired by your zine is one that is in process, and I'm working with my 7-year-old in making, because it's pretty tiny, and yeah, you have it right there. So this is my father recently passed. It's Henry Quiles. Passed away January 26th, brain aneurysm. He had multiple surgeries, and he had 6 surgeries in 2 weeks. And I give all these details because those are the last moments of my experiences with him. His name is so important for me to speak, because he is still a person whom I interact with, although he's not outside. These and things like this, these little, my daughter saves a lot of these tins, and we took one, and I was just like, what can we do? We have all this bric-a-brac and things around, and so she and I went around like looking for items to place inside. And there's things like palo and palo santo, and a small travel candle. Little menorah candles fit perfectly in here. And this is like anytime we're gonna go away. And even I like packing it in my bag. There's another one that I use. This is the newest one, but it's great because you keep it in your bag and you can set up anywhere. And I have this image and things that smell and feel great that that can help ground myself. And since my daughter has been a part of it, she's 7, this is hers as well. So this can go into her backpack, and she's allowed to participate with it and have conversation with it. And what's so important is that this translates so well, like a sensory box, translates so well for children. It helps. It's something that they do. They shove their pockets with and collect like stones and twigs and stuff like that. I think offering this language and offering those moments for a child to grieve with you at very young ages, opening that conversation and sharing this and like works with her has been really healing. And it was a great point to start. She has her own copy. She went to the Queens Museum and picked up her own copy, and she wrote in my dad's like grandpa and highlighted words. And so having something tangible to grab onto and to ground you, I think, was the most important thing for us to start with our dialogue between her and I.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was so touched when you said that Maddie has been working with you through this activity zine. And I probably should have prefaced that the zine is sort of gives you prompts for different aspects of loss. So one of those prompts is a sensory box and like a scavenger hunt. Other prompts are like a maze or coloring activities, or prompts for written responses or drawing responses, because it's not something that is necessarily going to like solve your problem, but it will help you in some way process or stay present, or just at the very least, at the most minimal, like think about it. Think about your grief, or thinking about this aspect of loss.
Sorry.
Anybody else want to? I know Liene had some really great images that she sent me for responses.
Yeah, I can talk. So for me, it was really interesting. Also, like just see afterwards, like being able to print here at home, and then being connected to something that is physically at the exhibition at the Queens Museum, but then kind of having my own copy. So that's really generous, to have that format. And also, I feel like this also like the idea of you know, if you're doing a zine, and I know it's not the first one, I've experienced other before when you created the exhibition, Latinx exhibition, and but for this one I really, of course, like connected so much because we are all going through this such a difficult time in many levels, and I thought that was really kind of interesting the way you laid out, you know, and kind of just think about, okay, let's think like each page is one kind of type of loss, and then that made me you know, kind of navigated through it, and or just like I let sit for a while until I interacted with it. And but something that was really interesting to see afterwards and to think about was to think about how this is playful, right, in a way that I don't have, like I'm comparing my notebook with this, and then I'm like my all the notebooks from this past year, it's being like black ink, pencil, and blue, kind of just that. Like it's really boring. It's really like, you know, kind of reflecting this moment. So every time I need to find something, I was like, oh, everything looks the same. I don't know where my notes are. And something that I was telling Christian this morning, that I was like, she made me wrote in colors this time. I got all my son like pencils, and I'm like, I'm just highlighting, you know, like I want to, because I felt like it's like a lot of black and white, kind of how my writings have been and my notes, but then like by having color and able to interact with it and just write in colors also brought me a lot of joy in that sense of like laying down, or the way you were suggesting us to make lists. So I feel like all your guidance to those little exercises was really you know, inspiring in that sense to me to kind of, okay, wait, you know, there is, you know, things to think. And something also that I noticed, and I think that I don't know if you want to show now. But
Yeah, let me pull that up.
The first like page where I it's something that's really, I think it's since grieving comes from our guts, right, our heart, and all of that. I felt like a lot of things I had to translate. I was like, let me see. So just to for all of those that don't know me, my mother tongue is Portuguese, and then I realized that I realized a long time ago when I couldn't do my therapy on English, for example. I had to find therapists in Portuguese because I could not express myself emotionally in other language that it's not my own, how I grew up in that sense. So then I felt like with the zine kind of instigated me like that, like, oh, I need to write in my own language. Like, so most of the things I mean, the writing is in Portuguese, and you know, adjusting that to kind of to my own way of feeling it and feeling in my own language. But anyhow, I feel like the zine really allows me this playful, or even though, like, you know, to think or framing in that sense, like laws of privacy was an exercise, a proposition that you did here in terms of the activity of the walking with intention, and I had those photographs that I did before, but it was something that really grounded me through the pandemic, being able to walk, and then luckily, like in Miami, I was able to go outside and not meeting anyone, and then having those moments of connection to, you know, everything that Christina, you mentioned, in terms of looking for the little things, the flowers, the birds, the colors, and made me really grounded in that sense. But also to think, you know, framing that kind of that activity with the loss of privacy. I also recently became a mom, and that was like 5 months before pandemic, and I kind of felt like those laws of privacy kind of really similar in the sense of becoming a mom, and also like working from home moms, right, with all the mothers working, parents working from home and having that difficulty in managing all. So I felt like and those images are really connecting to that, and thinking a lot about motherhood and the loss of privacy, and also the pandemic, so relating to it. So that's where kind of how we're kind of responding to it.
Great, thank you. That's so great to hear. Would anybody else like to jump in?
Yeah, I just really appreciate how this project of yours puts you in your body. And the pages that stood out to me kind of overlap a bit, like the loss of senses. And also I recently relocated during the pandemic, like by choice, you know, but it's just it's still a shock. And the two objects that I've been really gravitating towards as grounding objects are from my home. I could even just show them here. This is a quartz egg from my dad that I always like really cherished in his home as a child. And yeah, just he mailed it to me when I moved here, and it kind of adapts to the environment because the rock gets cold when it's cold, and just having something to like hold in your hands or press against your body, and remember that like you're physical in this world and moving through it with all of this weight, right? It's a weight we carry that can so often be shirked off in favor of like moving forward. Like as you say, all things must pass, but when, how, where, and the way we get there is not clear. It's a journey. And I just loved being able to journey with you, and how you extend your voice to us as someone who's kind of there for us in grief, right? But there's no need to ask. And I just thought that was such a beautiful way of being present with someone in absence. And as a friend, just to feel your presence from afar is like very touching to me. So those are some things that really stood out as I went through your zine and continue to return to it.
That's so lovely to hear. Thank you.
I would say actually it's been interesting to me in sort of walking with Christina as she was putting this project together and considering how it would fall into the exhibition curatorially and kind of thematically. And sorry, my neighborhood is so loud, it's just gonna be like that. It's been interesting because I've lost a number of people, pets, things in the past year, but actually like the single greatest tangible loss is I have an almost complete lack of space to reflect on anything. So I can't do this scene. I have not been able to do it because I don't have the space to do that. And it's been kind of the side effect of actually presenting and making space for a lot of people's work on care, that my own reflection has gone into that and not into sort of being able to focus on individual experience as much, which is not something that I regret or resent, but it's been really telling to me that in attempting to even consider doing an exercise for personal reflection, I'm profoundly aware of how little space I've had for that. And I think that's true across a lot of different sectors, that when people are oftentimes making space to present or promote care work, whether it's around grief or crisis or joy or birth or whatever, that is so kind of in and of a moment that the ability to reflect beyond that moment is compromised. And I think that that can be true of individual grief as well, for sure. But it's been the way in which I've been coming towards this as an individual person, and I would be really dishonest if I didn't admit it. So now you know.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because we actually had talked about emotional availability in terms of art when I was completing my first year of school. It was right after my father went into the hospital, and I just didn't have the bandwidth to make anything. I could barely read, I couldn't concentrate, and trying to complete my first semester of my MFA was extremely difficult, especially because it was on Zoom. And in a way, I could have only done it because it was on Zoom, because I had to physically be with my father every day to bring him to his appointments and such at the height of the pandemic. So in a way, this has let me be there for him and for my family, but it also complicated so much and that being in that caregiver role was so all-consuming. And I think a lot of times we as a group had discussed this previously, but women in particular tend to give all of this care, but forget sometimes to care for themselves. And there's a responsibility to heal yourself, which I think that's something that Rebecca brought up, right?
Yeah, just like thinking about how you make space for yourself and make space for others. Like, I think it's incredible you're able to be here with me, right? But it's in a different way than, like, it's amazing how you extend yourself in generosity toward us in your grief, right? In this form, which is a different way of doing emotional labor, or being expected to do emotional labor for other people that you sometimes grief is personal. And it's hard to say, I don't have space for that. I'm experiencing this. It feels like an expectation, and you want, I mean, for me, I desire to be there for people I care about. And it causes conflict, right? Like, I think there's a deep conflict and a almost ease in pushing your own needs to the back, because they're the harder, and it sometimes can be the harder things to face. In my personal experience, I could say, like, I can distract myself on end. And the nice thing about the zine is, like, being present, right? Not being on the screen, reading the words, feeling the objects, smelling the smells, and just having the thoughts. And when it's time to walk away, like, the space is there to do so. It's not required reading, but I think it's the offering of a space that you're providing to do that work with yourself, by yourself, or with a group, you know.
Yeah, I also really enjoyed being able to like turn to any page and just like, I didn't have to follow step 1, step 2. If you're lost, step 2, go back to step 1. You know, it's just like there's a levity in not being told to follow rules when you're in the thick of it, when you can't organize your head, when you're chemically altered in the middle of grief. You know, your cortisol levels are off the charts. Like your adrenaline is like at all different levels. And then, you know, I know myself, like knowing that I need something, and I do need some type of structure, but when people tell me then, you know, well, there are a couple of steps. I was like, I can't, don't give me a couple of anything. But being like, it didn't, like, not being told to do something is really important. And also there was no mention of like, just, you gotta be in a moment of positivity. Just if you're like, you're talking about death so much, or you're talking about loss of something. And I'm just like, I am in a place where I've never been before. It could be, you know, I'm in my apartment for an entire year. You know, I'm, you know, and I'm in, and now I'm without a person with whom I, you know, had plans with to have in my life for a lot longer than it happened. And I don't know how to be this person as I am right now. So then, you know, in being able to speak those things, it's not me being negative. And that's the whole thing. Like, we don't have a language built into our society for death and grief and loss, and just loss. Like, what do you do when you have to start from a whole new square one? You know, people just kind of want to cover it up with like positivity. Like, what the hell does that mean? Like, what do you find it? What do you do with it? And what does that look? Because that looks different for everyone. Not being force-fed rules is so important. And also it allowed me to escape, because, you know, it's okay to cocoon yourself, take care of yourself. And then when you're ready, you know, maybe you want to peek out, maybe you don't, that's okay, you know? So again, like not having like a structure. I mean, it's structural, but it wasn't force fed. And I feel like people want to force feed you like something to do right away. Like, this is the answer. Like, stop feeling pain, stop being sad, stop, you know, spiraling out, because it's painful for them to watch from the outside. And sometimes all you need to do is have somebody allow you to be silent, cocoon, and wait for you to reemerge.
That's a really beautiful point. I really strove to make this zine accessible, and like I said, emotionally accessible for when you're just not able to do it. You can maybe just look at some pictures or just kind of like trace your finger or whatever it is. Pick out some words that resonate, whatever, at the very bare minimum. But also just like accessible for people at different life stages, different experiences, people who are maybe essential workers or people who are working from home or who are students or children, or unemployed like me. So just trying to think about sort of different perspectives was really important to me, even if I hadn't personally experienced them. But I wanted to sort of offer up an openness and open space for people to insert their own story or their own feelings into the work as a sort of collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you offer is a space of softness, and we had talked about this as well. Like we're move ahead, right? Move ahead, get past it, plays into like the greater scheme of like you go to work and you are productive. This idea of productivity, and like sometimes that's unavailable. And I think it's a radical action to say like no to those things, and in a system that we lack systems for grief. Like you take personal days, but there's no, right, like there's something that signifies that that's a private journey. And so I think to claim that space of softness and kind of like ooziness almost, right, to take it up is a refusal to adhere to these like ideas of linearity or productivity, which are enforced.
Yeah, I think often enforced by sort of the patriarchal sort of capitalist system that we are in, that this idea of being soft is bad or weak, or so trying to take that softness and flexibility, and make it sort of strong or sort of resilient maybe was kind of a thing that I've been working on for myself.
I do think culturally, though, like there are ways in which softness specifically has actually been wielded as a tool in very manipulative spaces. And I like see people nodding. And so I'm curious, like when I say that, what that brings up for you, but I'll say what I was thinking of, just so I'm not like dropping that there and walking away. You know, I really have seen softness being wielded, especially within sort of like certain sectors of the internet and art and the art world on the internet, as a way of daring someone to encounter your difficult feeling, but not giving them very much if they do so. And I don't know that we have to always give people stuff if they encounter a difficult feeling, but I think there's a way in which when it becomes presentational, I find that to be like a little bit questionable. And I'm curious what other people are thinking of when I mention this too, because it's a concern for me, right? I don't think softness is softness across the board anymore.
That's such a beautiful beautiful thing that you said. I'm so sorry. But the first thing that popped up to my head was that if it can be exploitive, right? Like, and one thing, so what resurfaced a lot for me this past year during the pandemic is not only having managed the death of my father, his illness and then his death, but all the fear and past trauma from I have a son, Gus, who was stillborn at full term 40 weeks. So he was my very big first experience of trauma and death and grief and loss. And people who didn't know me wanted me to share my story for like their acting platform, for art's sake, because it was such a brave, heroic thing to have gone through. And that was that's when I started learning how to put up boundaries, because then it felt like people wanted access to my grief in this way because they can figure out how to make it look pretty and performative. And that is when I really started learning how to establish boundaries. Because my tears were pretty, and the story would look pretty and draw others in, but there was no reciprocity and support at all. It was people wanting me to speak of like being a hero, and that was horrific. And then I shut down, and I logged off of all social media. And I broke away from all my different communities because I didn't want to be this performative like person of loss, ragged, like crazy, running around. I was like, are people viewing me? But yeah, sorry, that's how I interpreted that, Chloe, to mean for me in that.
I feel like I've definitely witnessed what you're speaking about, Chloe. And I think it's you putting it into words is very powerful. And I think it's wielded in such a way where the term self-care has become like, yeah, like it's just overstretched. And how do we, I think self-care, right? Like if done in a way that is needed and responsible is like needed. I think that's wonderful that you can take that space for yourself. But in the marketing of it during the pandemic, like the capitalization on it has been really horrific. Yeah, it's horrific to watch something so needed for so many people become a dollar sign or become a way to disconnect from others, to put up boundaries. And I think when you need that space, yes. And I also have a hard time with how do we use words without them losing meaning? How do we build language around things that are, deep and complex, and have depth and carry us, right? These things are there to help carry us without them being exploited by these gross systems or by an overuse of language.
Yeah, I definitely feel that at sometimes too, because I do make a lot of work that's very personal and somewhat trauma based, and I have felt tapped out at certain points where I've had to take steps back, or just sort of like reassess how I'm showing my work and presenting it and for whom and why. I think with this, my intention going in was to create something for myself that hopefully other people would get something out of. And in trying to make this with myself in mind, but also open enough that other people could access it, And it also being, a public program for the museum and free, that people could take it or leave it in a way that felt okay for them to engage with how they wanted to, if that makes sense.
And I think also like the way you write in terms of, from your personal perspective, but also being really generous, and kind of acknowledging the other ways of how, even though you're like putting titles in all different types of loss, but you still like open up that so much that you kind of acknowledging others ways or other so that I thought was really, really also touching. And so that was a interesting point to it as well.
And I appreciate that there's no loss competition of types of loss, and like making space for all different sorts of grieving and losses, and some things that we hesitate to maybe consider as things that we grieve or don't have the language of grief built around them, and validating those sorts of things, seeing it as truly a spectrum, was really great, honestly, because I think there's a fear to take up space a lot of the time, where you feel like someone's grief is greater than yours, this measuring that we had talked about. And the opening of that, like, how do we open doors and bridge different types of grief and be in it, together.
Yeah, because I've experienced all of these types of grief throughout this year, and some of them more than others, obviously. Losing of my father being sort of the greatest one for me. But for other people, it might have been just the loss of purpose, like this kind of ennui that you have, or it could be the loss of a community, the loss of a place like your favorite restaurant closes down, or a neighborhood business that's been there for 20 years closes down. And and all of those things are hard. And I also relocated to be with my family. So I pretty much just dropped my apartment and had to move in with my parents for about 9 months. And the loss of my personal space was a big one for me to deal with on top of everything else. So it really is a spectrum, and sort of a, things, sometimes that loss of space hit me more than the loss of place, of structure. But all of them affected me in some way or another.
Right. And like when you don't have space, where do you go to process? When you have like all the stimuli like coming at you, I kept on joking. It's like, I just need to be in a closet. I'm gonna hide in the closet, like, just to block out the stimuli sometimes, so I can just think about or process something. And it's, and my daughter is so tired of me being in class with her, like she's still online, and she's deeply grieving like her own social life at 7. I would be passing, by the computer she's working on, and I hear something her teacher says, and she's like, I'm like, I'm sorry. Like, it's so we're mixing into all these real personal spaces. Like, that's her personal time. and being able to remind myself to like pull myself away from her time as a child and what she needs has been really hard for me because my desk is just like less than 5 feet away from hers. But just needing that, yeah, like that space to process and to not have everyone inside your office space or your school space or your conversations with friends. Like, I'm tired of going to the bathroom to have like an on-screen conversation with a couple of friends. That's not even like the perfect quiet place, because everybody needs a bathroom.
Yeah, and even like this idea of digital privacy was something that I kind of picked up on early on. Just like this, maybe Zoom calling is like kind of invasive, and you're sort of entrusting your sense of connection with the outside world to these kind of big corporations, which is a little scary. So that is also a sort of loss of privacy with people sort of in your home in a digital space as well.
It's another thing though that, like, in contrast with so many other forms that we've found of engagement sort of before the pandemic, right? Like Janice, you were saying, when you were really deep in grief, you needed to leave social media. And I think that it's often true that we need to leave social media in order to have our actual experiences happen in an unmediated way or mediated only by the people who are around us. That said, there are a lot of people who need social media to feel like they're going through a thing, right? And I don't want to presume what kind of person anyone is. You reflected on your experience, so I'm just bringing it again to light here. I fall more in that direction as well, but I can't pretend that it's not also and equally and powerfully true that sort of some of the platforms that have diminished our privacy the most have also been really beneficial to people. And it just kind of depends on what sort of person you are. And I think, there's been a lot of effort and a lot of think pieces that have tried to organize this categorically as though it's always one thing or the other. You're one type of person or the other. You're an introvert or an extrovert. You need social media or you hate social media. And I just don't think that's true anymore. And some of the gray area contained in all of that, I think also actually is a shared space of cultural grief, but misunderstanding as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've experienced kind of both sides of it simultaneously, in that I in the midst of like really heavy grief, I couldn't interact with certain things on social media. And I had to like tell people, like, please don't message me. If you want to reach out, just send me a meme. Send me something that's going to make me laugh, like a stupid cat video. And then on the other hand, I also had a lot of really great resources to help with practical things, like the neighborhood Buy Nothing group and various other neighborhood groups, where I was able to source supplies to care for my father. Things like carts and, baby monitors and like all of this stuff that like we didn't have to necessarily shell out to buy. And that there was a sort of support network in that. And when I would go and pick up these things, sometimes I would talk to the people that I was picking stuff up for. I actually got my first tarot deck through the Buy Nothing group. And that person who gave me the tarot deck was really open to listening and being there for me in that really difficult time. And we became friends through that. So it was kind of a really interesting way of interacting with my neighbors and the people around me through both an online space and a physical space.
Yeah, I've created in the past 11 years the most incredible network of fellow lost families that we've never met, and they have held me up during all the hard times. Like, we've exchanged like our home addresses and mail packages out to one another, and so yeah, there's this huge like contradiction, always in me needing to protect myself, but the the outreach I've been able to make within social media has been incredible. Looks like we have a question, Christina.
Yeah, so we have a question from Christy. Catherine, would you mind unmuting Christy so they can ask their question? To see if you're around.
Yes, just give me a second.
Sure.
Christy, do you feel comfortable?
Christy just said in the chat that she
bring-
doesn't have access to a mic.
Okay.
Okay.
So I will go ahead and read it. Question for the speakers. How have you, if you do, processed grief by focusing on what you've gained, i.e. gratitude and filling in empty space? So one thing that was important to me is sort of ending the zine with a page on gratitude, and that's this one here. And so I utilized kind of my tarot knowledge to bring a coloring activity. And as an adoptee, I have a really complicated relationship with gratitude because oftentimes the common perception of adoption is that it's this sort of fairy tale narrative, and that it's like a solution to a lot of world problems. But meanwhile, it could also be sort of the product of a lot of world problems, meaning that there's a lot of Western intervention in poorer countries and babies sort of being sent to richer, wealthier, wider countries. Now, something that is told to adoptees is that they should be grateful that they're not any longer in that third world country, that they should be grateful that they grew up with the privilege that they now enjoy. And that's something that I tend to really buck against. So in doing this zine, I was a little hesitant in naming it as gratitude, but I think that it was important to just show these kind of glimmers of something else that's not grief, something that you can see that's outside of that kind of bubble, and to not dismiss the grief or not say that everything is going to be fine, or that what you're feeling isn't horrible, but to say that there is something else at the very least. And that was kind of my aim for that. But I would love to hear other people's interpretations.
Yeah, we had this conversation, and one of a huge pet peeve of mine is I get a lot from people who mean well, who are using scripted one-liners that are usually offered as condolence, or when people don't know how to speak to you when learning of a loss, is when they say, well, at least. And it triggers me so horribly. Well, at least, you're still breathing. At least they're no longer in pain. Yes, yes, yes. At least you're able to eat and you have a bed. Yes, yes, at least, yeah, of course. But it's like, it's the person's way of like trying to prevent themselves from feeling any of the horror behind the loss of whatever it is. It's their scripted way of saying, I've got to fix this in my head. This is so painful. I don't know what to say, but at least you're good, right? You're good. And so it's just, I know people, the line, the people have all these great intentions, but the great intentions are most often the most painful in the lines to use, because they're easy throwaway lines. They don't get to really sit with what you've just lost or what you've just spoken of. And sometimes you don't need to say anything at all. But the at least line is like, you should still be grateful is the undertone.
Yeah, and in speaking about sort of communities that we've lost, like I said, I have found a lot of communities, like I said, the Buy Nothing group, online communities, activist communities, to help either distract or help, you know, with resources and physical mutual aid. That there are things that could be gained through these losses, which is kind of icky to say, but you know, maybe you lose your place of work, but you gain a work from home and a cat as a coworker. You know, maybe you lose, I don't know, some kind of thing, but you gain something else, and maybe there's something in that that you can kind of appreciate, you know, at the very least. It's tricky though, and I don't want to be prescriptive about it.
There's another question in the chat from Daisy. Daisy, do you want to unmute yourself, or shall we read it?
Sure. I was really interested in the comment about radical softness, because this is kind of what I've experienced. I'd love to know from other people who have complex trauma and who, when they go through periods of reliving that trauma in another situation, you know, a lot of the time we like to think of radical softness as this cute thing where, you know, you're vulnerable with someone and, you know, it's just, oh, you know, we're letting down the walls, and, you know, we're being, you know, we're learning how to communicate in a way that, you know, exposes us. But sometimes that exposure, you know, sometimes it's rage, you know. And I think that a lot, you know, if someone commented about, you know, the fakeness of the internet world, where that talks about vulnerability, and a lot of the time it kind of just sounds like they're talking about, you know, the easier emotions for people to process. But for me, radical softness when I'm in trauma is rage. And there's no faster way for me to find out who are the friends who are actively engaging in making spaces for me because they care about me than when I go into that space and I'm trying to, you know, my spiraling looks like rage. And there are people that don't know how to hold that kind of softness, quote unquote. I'd love to know other people who struggle with this.
I don't know that I necessarily struggle with it, but like I definitely, in sort of presenting my own work that deals with a wide range of emotions that are actually very rarely my emotions. And I never said that they were, but people sort of perceive them that way. And I think that's also the easier way of looking at work that deals with feeling, is that it must be the artist's feeling. But I will say that it's precisely for this reason, what you're articulating, that like I have a really big problem with like empathy dialogues at large, because they presume that sort of to take the empathic position is to feel a particular way, and that particular way is sort of like to match the feeling of the person that you're sitting with, as if you can really accurately read that, and as if you know even what you're bringing to it within your own sentiment, and as if the other person also knows very clearly what they're feeling, so that you could reach an agreement that seems like it has a lot of risk points for going wrong. And then once you sort of reach that agreement, right, that will constitute some form of work that will do something in the world. And I think that can happen. I don't think that empathy doesn't exist, but I think that like allowing for sort of these spikier feelings and also the exhaustion of feeling into someone else's spiky feelings is a big point for me of why I don't want to rely on empathy as a motivator for getting things done. So, you know, like maybe including some of those struggles and the spaces that they open up, and maybe even also the spaces that they close off as we're trying to come to understand each other and trying to understand what to do in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think in talking about sort of rage and grief, we have to sort of talk about this idea of like tone policing, and sort of when you're being harmed or being hurt, uh, and you say something about it that people tend to tell you how you should say it. Um, and that's something that we need to work on, like as a society. And there's not an easy answer for that at all. But that's something that really made me think about. And as far as, some of the more political things that have been going on during this pandemic, I've certainly felt rage over the lack of response that our government has had. Rage at people who are not wearing their masks, all of that kind of stuff. Uh, a lot of it coming out of fear for me, being afraid for my family, and myself and my health. Um, and a lot of that looked like rage, and I was not uncomfortable about it. To say that as a New Yorker, New Yorkers tend to be angry. And that is something that I was okay expressing.
Yeah, Daisy, I really appreciate that question, because I think for me, I'm definitely more of a rager than a softness person, but it's been about accepting that in myself. To some degree, I think it's hard to accept fully. I don't like what that looks like sometimes, and it's hard to feel that tear of wanting to be that person who can handle things for myself, and then feeling sort of out of control, and wanting to break shit sometimes, and being like, what is this destruction that I'm wreaking on? Is this helping or hurting my, like, how am I processing? But I think understanding for me that, like, sometimes that's where I need to be, and like I need to sit in it, and it's uncomfortable. And I agree, like I think it's uncomfortable for other people to witness, like, quote unquote ugly feelings, like this, like it's not, they don't know how to respond. um but yeah, I think that softness I find is maybe in some sort of saying okay to myself. And the folks who witness without trying to mend, right, sometimes can provide the most space, or like people who let you kind of have your time to process, and not say at least, or it's all right, or perhaps you should have a glass of water or take a walk, is like sometimes the thing that just like breaks you more. Because who is someone else to dictate what you need in your coping and your grief and your rage? So yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that to the surface for the conversation.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the primal scream. And let me tell you, I don't know how people didn't like call like EMT on me, like when initially like walking through the streets in my deepest crazy. And I use the word crazy, but that's how I felt, because it was unmanageable and it was in a different headspace, and it was a different, there was nowhere, I had zero resources at the time. I never knew, I didn't know what to do at that moment. And I'm walking the dog at like 2 a.m, screaming on my block, just needed to do that I didn't want to shove a pillow in my mouth and like mute my scream. I needed to just let it out. And I saw one of my friends who's an incredible acupuncturist, and she was one of my caretakers. She actually on the table while offering me this treatment, she asked me to just scream it out on the table while she held my hand. And I'd never, ever thought that that would be an appropriate thing to do. But when you're in the middle of rage and that trauma, I can't even tell you what having somebody hold my hand and telling me, just let it out in a safe room, safe space, and no judgment. It is a whole other me that falls into that space. And at the same time, that is the person that I constantly want to give hugs to all the time. But I absolutely am a huge fan and trying to get it out in the safest space possible for myself, you know. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
I think we can have maybe some last thoughts, or if there's any other questions, please put them in the chat because we are going to be winding down. So if anybody else would like to say some words, or if there was anything else that you want to talk about or that stood out to you about this topic, go ahead. Okay, we have a question here from Elizabeth.
Yeah, it's, let me see. Do you mind sharing the name of the person who loved to scream it out? She's the beautiful Leah Kim. I don't, she's moved out of New York. I think but she practices in New York. Christina, you're going to have a page for like a reference page available for posted somewhere, right?
Yeah.
I will look for her. Yeah, her contact information. She is incredible with, and I don't think she considers herself a grief worker, but she definitely is. She is the person to feel safe to do that with. Yeah, I'll get that information to add to the list.
Yeah, just as a quick note, on my website, we will be giving everyone access to a list of grief resources broken up by topic. So we will add that, and it's going to be like a Google Drive page, in addition to the same place where you can download the zine and look at some of the other works. And hopefully when this video is up and open to the public, we will have this discussion up there as well.
I don't know if there's I think we have a little time, right? To just because since we are all here, we are all creatives. So I'd like to talk also more in terms of the laws of creativity, right? Or the production. I know we tackled that like in the more general, but I don't know, I'd like to hear from you, like, you know, as art practice, in the terms of like that laws, or how the grief will influence that. Because I remember like I reacted to different ways when I lost my grandma. I really need to do artwork to have something, like as Janice mentioned, like a tangible thing and not think about the situation. And then for me it was kind of a relief in opposing to when, like with the pandemic and everything, that it kind of shut me off, and then I couldn't produce, couldn't make work, right? Because I was so much within the situation that I couldn't, it was really like field works that I could kind of had my headspace or like motivation to do so. So I don't know if we have a great time to hear some of you, because I feel like, you know, of course, like the zine, it's a way for you, right, Christina, to kind of have that outlet, and it was really amazing. But I would love to hear from others.
maybe Janice or Rebecca.
Personally, I started my MFA this year, and there really hasn't been, I think a lot of folks in art programs right now are possibly struggling with this, like this expectation to produce, to grow, to shift ideas, to change your work, to overhaul things. And in that in itself, there's loss, and there's loss of your privacy as an artist when you're suddenly in a program with other people. And that's been hard for me to continue producing. It's also been rewarding in the sense of providing a new community and folks who like are engaging with similar struggles. I think like everyone is responding differently. For me, it's ebbs and flows, periods of like radical production and periods of just like, wow, I can't believe I got out of bed and drank some coffee today. And trying to be less judgmental of the days where I get out of bed and drink some coffee, I think has been a big step for me.
I think I haven't been able to, I mean, I have, in order to mind dump, I needed to start making just lists of those pieces that I would like to prepare like paper for or panel for, but I haven't. The only thing, it's so funny, that I was able to really do is like just throw paint on paper. So like no, like with no rules, just throw paint on paper because I don't have to do anything else. And then eventually, like, you know, this is just paint drying. I started mixing colors and let it dry. And I intentionally bought like an accordion book for it so that it can speak to one another. And then maybe it'll be something, but it's a nice placeholder for like my hopes and dreams of like the next act, like to complete like my series of, you know, start blowing up the dust off of the files of things that I've wanted to complete. But just so that I keep my hand-eye motion, you know, keeping a brush in my hand, but without it having to be a thing. That was really important for me because I don't have the capacity these past few months to make it a thing, outside of like working with, you know, my daughter on the mini travel ofrendas. But yeah, I'm not putting pressure on myself to create something that's going to be beautiful for somebody else.
I totally agree. I resonate with that so much because I found it so hard to make any kind of work for a long time. Doing sort of intuitive painting was the closest I could get to making anything. And there was a time when I couldn't make anything at all. And so I tried to teach myself how to knit. Um, and I've been working on the same scarf for like 10 months. And it's, you know, when I find myself kind of floating or feeling ungrounded or feeling kind of adrift, or antsy, I will pick up my scarf and continue to knit one, you know, one thing at a time, one row at a time, and put it down. And the next time I feel antsy, I'll pick it up again. And that was another way, like you said, to just keep my hands busy. And then I also talk a little bit about this in the zine. Learning tarot was a really good way for me to keep my cognitive mind in a place of looking at and analyzing art, and relating it to my life, relating it to, you know, sort of historical narratives, art history, all of these sort of signs and symbols that you come accustomed to looking at as an artist, but I wasn't able to look at art, you know, at that point. I was able to look at tarot because I was learning something, something different, something unrelated. And I think sometimes as an artist, you get this perception of that, oh, you're so lucky, you can make art and express yourself through your art. So, you know, you must be making so much during this pandemic or when you're going through it. And I feel like a lot of times that's a misconception, or at least for me it is, because I find it really hard to make to make art. And I think because I make a lot of really intensely personal conceptual art, that I am very sort of my own harshest critic. And I'm just not able to do that when I'm going through it. So people who were like, oh yeah, you know, art is therapy. For me, it's not like that at all. And I find it very difficult. So this is the closest thing that I've made to art as therapy. And I don't really see it as that. I see it as sort of just a way to extend compassion to myself and to others. And that's really the most therapeutic that I can get, really. Any last thoughts, Chloe, maybe? You? No? Okay. Hold on.
Somebody did write in the chat. Oh, it's active. But yeah, Flor says making art, particularly from a space of intuition, just following an instinct, when has been huge for me. I didn't really understand what I was doing until someone else saw it. I started sewing orange peels together and invited others to join me, but didn't realize I was healing in the process only later. So yes to making anything.
Mm-hmm. April says, I've been asking my peers, art therapists, if they've been doing more art for their own self-care during the pandemic, and most say they have been making less art this past year and finding it harder during the pandemic to create independently outside of their work. Scheduled community art making via virtual art hives and professional development has provided some brief space and things needed to be simple and accessible in the moment. Yeah. Yeah, finding I am an arts educator, and Rebecca and I have actually worked together with a well-known youth group and creating sort of STEAM programming. And that's something that I've missed a lot, is being in those sort of community spaces and working with kids and working with the public face to face. So in shifting everything online, you know, we got laid off basically. So, you know, having to see these institutions and organizations come up with online programming has been interesting, and some of it's been successful and some of it hasn't. But it's definitely different for sure. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Catherine, if you'd like to take it from here.
Yeah, no, thank you, Christina, Liene, Janice, Rebecca, Chloe. Thank you also to Jana for interpreting. This has been an incredible conversation. The only thing I can say in closing is that the exhibition that this work is also presented within, Art as Social Action, 10 Years of Social Practice Queens, is on view at the Queens Museum. We're open. We welcome you to visit. You can pick up a zine copy there. We've also added the link to Christina's website in the chat. And thank you. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to everyone for joining us.